morning. This is us on the Full Scottish at Broadcasting Scotland. We have a special feature to share with you today. If you want to tweet to us, you can use the hashtags that are going to show up in the bottom of the screen in a second. Today we're here with the Artistic Director of the Lyceum, Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh, that's David Greig. And we have Lisa Peebles, who's a housing rights advocate here in Glasgow. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hiya. So we've had another interesting week in politics, and we're looking forward to another extremely interesting, intense week in politics. Maybe as a brief summary, I'll go into what happened and summarise it a little bit for you. So we had the indicative votes process, and that cut short. There was meant to be another session of indicative votes, which got a result that was exactly split down the middle. So the Speaker of the House made the decision according to the rules and voted against it. The next thing that happened is that different bills came through the House of Lords, but Theresa May actually had the gall to, in an act of really bad faith, instead of waiting for that to pass through the House of Lords and to get royal assent, she had on Monday night already sent this to a letter to the EU and asked them for an extension until the 30th of June. This is kind of important because there was a bill that Joanna Cherry introduced that would have prevented for all of us a no-deal Brexit. The reason why that didn't happen was because Labour whipped against participating in this vote. And so Labour was actually the reason that this is not off the table and continues not to be off the table, only to the next day support a bill that was very poorly worded. This was the Yvette Cooper Bill. And this bill also got passed, but now that Theresa May has gone and requested an extension for Article 50 not to be triggered until the 30th of June, so that we won't leave the EU until then, we're again in a very strange and not particularly democratic area of politics, and not entirely sure where we're going with this. I think, to start off with, you come from a very creative background, but all of us are kind of dragged into this mire of politics. Are you finding yourself able to keep up with it still? I feel like we're missing a day and everything goes out the window.
It's a story that's moving so quickly in some ways, and in other ways it's completely static, it's not changing. I mean, Limmy, when he tweets, has a thing sometimes where he'll tweet after a big event that people get very excited about, whether it's in Trump's world or Brexit, and he'll tweet, nothing's going to change, nothing's going to change. And it's partly a joke, but actually I think he's bang on the money that the big thing underlying this is nothing has changed. So every day there's a different thing, there's an indicative vote, there's something, she sends a letter, nothing has changed. The EU has the power to either decide or not decide whether we're in or out with no deal, and there is no majority, there is no plan, there is no nothing in any part of our democratic system as it currently exists outside of Holyrood, where Nicola Sturgeon has been relatively clear about what she wants. There is no plan, and there is no majority for a plan, and there is no means to getting a plan, because every angle that they go down, whether it's a general election, you can't call a general election with May as Prime Minister because she said she's going to resign, so it would have to be a Tory leadership election, and before you can say Jack Robinson, it's June of whatever and we're out again. There's no majority for a thing in Parliament, so Parliament can't take control. Just every angle you look at, you end up in the same place, and that's why I'm afraid I'm very pessimistic about it. The other thing I would say about being creative about it is not only could I not write this, could nobody write this, but if anybody did write this, I would say to them, this is just unstageable, it's boring. Well, not boring, it's just repetitive, it doesn't make any sense. You know, go and make it have a point, and then I'll think about making a film of it or whatever. It just feels like a dreadful mire.
And it's extremely complex, I think, especially for younger people who aren't used to the procedures as such, but are interested in the political outcomes more than anything. We're suddenly seeing an array of so-called democratic mechanisms that come from Westminster that I have never heard of in my life, and especially as a foreigner, it seems absurd. Nobody could if you tried to reinvent democracy, you wouldn't do it like that. Nobody could come up with these procedures.
But the thing that I keep coming back to through this entire process, and as you say, it's changing day by day, hour by hour, the phrase that keeps going through my head is democracy's dead. You know, because there was a democratic process where people chose a very, very bad decision. And it's a bit like, I see it as a bit like national self-harm. You know, adults are entitled to have autonomy over their bodies and do whatever they want to them, but sometimes through that autonomy they make bad decisions and hurt themselves, and this to me is the same thing. You know, and people in situations like that, you know, intervene and prevent people making those bad decisions and harming themselves. And when I look at this, the whole democratic process has been exposed as a complete and total failure, because actually democracy leads to very bad decisions sometimes.
I'm not sure that I understand that we went through a democratic process, but it was a deeply corrupted democratic process, asking a question that couldn't be answered, not even by the politicians and experts at the time. The research wasn't done, and the important research that we had wasn't being brought to light, considering that this Brexit campaign was fought on immigration. The immigration numbers were deliberately suppressed, not only by David Cameron, but by Theresa May. David Cameron wanted to fight on immigration and said, look, we've got statistics that show that EU migration has no negative impacts on the UK. Nonetheless, there was a convolution of the refugees coming over and taking over the country, and that then got, you know, mixed in with EU migration. It was a democratic. It was intended to be a democratic thing, but
isn't there the thing? Your point about democracy feels to me that the referendum itself was already an expression of the failure of democracy. So the fact that there hadn't been, so you have devolution, but it doesn't apply to England. There isn't proportional representation in this country, so lots of people who have views that I don't particularly like, but nevertheless they're there. There's 5 million of them, and they got one MP. You know, they barely got one MP if in terms of UKIP. There was a failure of the British democratic system to represent our problems, economic problems, problems of national sovereignty, and so on. And the one thing people could do was vote leave. They could say, right, okay, if we do that, that'll jam a stick in the works. And it's jammed a really big stick in the works. And it's exposed that our system is not up to it. It's not up to dealing with our problems.
What you were saying was really interesting about the suppression of the statistics. And I always find in situations like this, whether it, going back to the independence referendum or this referendum that led to Brexit, people don't care about statistics. People are dealing in narrative. They've got a predefined story that is their truth, which might not actually have any relationship with the actual truth, but it's their truth. And if when people present, coherent ideas or coherent statistics disproving what they believe, they're dismissive of them. So there's something about how people who can influence other folk that we need to really up our game and take the information from those statistics, but actually deliver it in a narrative style that people understand and want to hear. People aren't stupid, they know their experience, and when somebody is presenting an idea that is different from what their lived truth is, then they can dismiss everything. And what you said about the 5 million people whose views are incredibly uncomfortable, they are really uncomfortable, but actually we need to listen to them, and we need to have a way of countering it, to dismiss them and to dismiss everything that they say, because a significant proportion of their politics are abhorrent. It's a really, really dangerous thing, because as soon as people feel unheard, this is what happens.
I think that's true, though. I think there's a couple of points that we can mention. I'm not sure if you'll agree with me, but I believe that the way that politics is done in the UK is specifically focused on extroverts. We have a fantastic array of people in this country, but not everybody is suited to out and out extroversion, and extroversion is what drags the story, the personal narrative out there. It's something that is much easier represented by somebody who is an extrovert. This is one of the things that I think is incredibly difficult to break into. How do introverts tell their story? How can politics be much more about having people who don't function in that way, who don't get their energy out of, you know, being around people, but, you know, find resolution within themselves and find peace in that way. Obviously in theatre you're likely to come across a lot more extroverted people, but I'm sure there's actors and, you know, people involved that are not necessarily extroverted in their basic stance, but do it professionally.
I haven't come across that particular analysis, but I really like it, I find it very interesting. But I think a bigger thing maybe relates to that is that, again, the democratic system that we could aspire to, that I got excited about in 2014 when I thought there was a chance we would be creating a constitution from the ground up, could involve citizens' assemblies, it could involve all kinds of things that include people into politics, that bring people in. Because democracy, based on just voting once in an election, as we know, is, well, first of all, is not enough. But secondly, Germany has a constitution. Most European countries have constitutions. We don't. We have a kind of... Britain has inherited its own hodgepodge of things that have happened, compromises, muddles, ways that things got solved, that was created by an establishment and an imperial and monarchical system, and it's just been allowed to run into the 21st century like a clapped out car, and it's now falling apart. So for me, all the things you're talking about, all these, we have the politicians we deserve because we have the system that produces them.
Absolutely. I think the point that we were all making about a non-representative democratic system is also very true for EU elections. I mean, we're facing the possibility of an extension that runs beyond the EU elections, which would force the Tories and other Brexiteers, let's not pretend like Labour and the Labour leadership are not Brexiteers at this point. We would force them into the uncomfortable position of potentially having the UK participate in EU elections again. It's uncomfortable for them, but if we're honest, the UK hasn't properly participated in EU elections. This is how it is possible with a small amount of people participating. Those that want change are easily led, and you know, this is how we send UKIP representatives to Brussels when there's not even one sitting in Parliament in Westminster at this point. It's an insane proposition to not make the counter-arguments, and I think that kind of ties in with what we were saying about Westminster as well. Okay, there's false arguments made and very emotional stories told, and I think it's legitimate. People will want change. There's a lot of things wrong with this country, but the narrative was pushed as a scapegoating mechanism. If it's migrants, or if it's the unemployed or disabled people, all of these people are, you know, are important, but we have allowed them to be scapegoated. The point here is not that there's one narrative going on, but the counter-narrative is not being put up at all. Yes, there is uncomfortable topics that we have to talk about. There's an uncomfortable, distasteful sort of argument that is being made and has convinced a lot of people to vote certain ways or to act certain ways, to support certain politicians. Without the counter-argument being made, we cannot complain. And this is where I think Scotland has an opportunity. Scotland quite often is willing, and the Scottish government at the minute as well, is willing to make the counter-argument. This is how we're still surviving as a slightly more welcoming society.
Well, I mean, even this morning, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to read the article that Smina Akhtar wrote. And she's an anti-racism activist, and I personally have not had a chance to read the article yet. But what I did do was, it was in the National, and I read the comments on her article, and her premise is that for Scotland to truly be an anti-racist society and to be different, we need to acknowledge our historical past and our involvement. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial topic. You know, at no stage is anybody saying that we should in some way be punished now. But this was the basic premise. And when I read the comments that people made, and these are comments from people who are activists within our communities, There was even somebody who started their comment with, we need to get this woman out of our country. So yes, I think we are protected a wee bit in Scotland in terms of our national government here and the policies that the national government you know, puts forward, and they are distinct and different from what's happening in Westminster. But actually, we've still got a problem here when it comes to, you know, our attitudes towards migration and refugees and racism and all these horrible, nasty things. It's no good enough to just stand with a salt iron and say Sor Album or Jock Damson's bairns, because actually we're no.
Yes.
I would agree with that, and I think that we can't. There's a certain thing we can be proud of in Scotland, which is that because we've had 20 odd years of devolution with proportional representation and a political system that, at least in some ways, was built for a purpose, we have not had to have a political culture, and I would include Labour within this, and actually even to a degree the Tories in Scotland have not had to pander to race or to fear of the other as a means of getting votes. So we've had 20 years where our political culture, and in fact our newspaper culture as a result, hasn't really needed to particularly push those lines in the way that in England with the big tabloid papers and the Westminster system, they've got votes.
Lack of devolved democracy.
Yeah, but so I guess what I'm trying to say is Scottish people absolutely are no less, and they're no more morally good than any other set of people in the world, and we do have really do have problems. We've problems with race and with all kinds of things we'd rather not talk about. But I do think, and we have to. We absolutely have to talk about them. I think the thing we can be proud of is that our political system doesn't particularly require that to be the engine of its you know, vote achieving at the moment. But if we don't start digging in, I think it's a myth to say, oh, you know, we're, as you say, well, you know, we're all welcoming, or Scotland's all fine, until someone points out that their experience is that isn't fine, and then say, oh, well, you better get away then, you probably hate us. And
the instant that happened, I just use her article as an example. It was, you know, it was straight back to good old-fashioned misogyny, you know, calling her a cow, saying hen, enough of that, you know, really like dismissive, you know, terminology, and, you know, a smattering of racism, which they would, of course, deny. But when you tell an Asian woman that her experience is, you know, not true, and her perspective is, you know, does not reflect what they believe a modern Scotland to be, and just dismiss that, then what does that say about us?
I'm really delighted that both of you bring this up. This is something that I keep harping on about, both in my personal life and my political life and on Broadcasting Scotland. Yes, Scotland is a more welcoming nation, but this is also important to note. It is important to note that words are not all that counts. We are in a situation where, at the point where, you know, this week Nicola Sturgeon launched another campaign to make EU citizens feel welcome. At the point when, if I hear you're welcome here, we want you to stay one more time, I will actually explode. I understand that that is a positive sentiment, and there's an awful lot of EU citizens that are incredibly grateful for it. We are. But gratefulness ends at a point, because this is just the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do for Scotland and for humanity. We can't continuously feed cookies for people for just doing the right thing. And this rhetoric needs to be backed up by actual policy making. As long they have now published on the Scottish Government website that is directed at EU citizens, they have now finally, after 2.5 years, published some guidance to employers. But there's actually, the guidance says, look, you can't discriminate against EU citizens, at least until we leave the EU. The same kind of proofs of ability to work and stay here remain the same until we leave. So that's until the December 2020. There shouldn't be another proof required. And this is something that's already happening. People are being asked for proof that doesn't physically or even emotionally or in any way exist in the UK yet. People don't have this proof because it doesn't exist. But until people can actually report discrimination, until there's an actual hotline to do this with, it is just kind words. And I don't think employers are actually particularly helped by that either.
Sorry. I was just going to say then there's a couple of things happening with that kind of stuff. Sometimes because I've seen reports of people being subject to what we would call discrimination, but it's because the people who are doing the discriminating are amateur. They don't understand the rules and regulations of employment and what they are required to do. So there's that whole amateur side of it. People are asking for additional evidence when actually it's neither required nor available. But then there's that whole other side of it where people who are just a bit nasty are emboldened by it. And that's the amateurism you can resolve by giving people proper policies and procedures to work within, but the emboldening of people's quite right-wing feelings that were pre-existing anyway, which then gives them the power to discriminate, or they feel they've got the power to discriminate against EU migrants. It makes my blood boil.
It is a very upsetting issue, and I think it can't be handled by just relying on people's moral instincts. This is something that migrants in the UK, but also in Scotland, really have to deal with. At least in Scotland, as residents of Scotland, you are partially protected by Scots law. You know, the rest of the UK has different laws, but you're protected by Scots law. Obviously, immigration isn't devolved to the UK, to the Scottish government yet, but there must be ways and means of fixing this in the Scots law that in some ways gives people in Scotland, residing in Scotland, a way of recourse against being discriminated. And yes, there's a slightly different case to be made between people who are seeking employment and people who are already employed. That is quite differently and severely affecting the people that are applying for jobs. Because if you're insecure as an employer and you've got 20 British applicants and somebody who isn't British, it's not a difficult thing to just dismiss that one application, even if it might be the perfect candidate for the role that you're writing out.
If I could tell just one story slightly to the side of this, but it's emblematic that we got at the Lyceum the email through sort of saying, you know, here's the new, not here's the new guidelines, but here is guidance, just to really essentially saying what you've just said, that there's no reason to discriminate. And we were sort of looking at it, and I was just trying to get my head around what I'm supposed to say, and I thought, well, how many EU people do we have on our payroll? And I don't really know, because it's never really been a thing I've asked. And I was next to a woman who I work with who's from Northern Ireland, and she said, well, technically I'm an EU citizen, but I've just been forced to become British. And that was because the government have basically, to solve that problem, have decided that if you're Northern Ireland, you're British. And her point was, and it was made with some vehemence, that you know, this was a small example of she's not. She's an EU citizen. That's how she perceives herself, and yet, you know, you can't just go, oh no, it's fine because you're British. That's a terrible approach. The identity thing under this, I think, is very important as well, because the EU citizens who are here, working here, I think they don't. The perception of ourselves as European actually underlies all of this. A few years ago, we were able to be Scottish, European, British if we wanted to be as well, and all of those things could be held. But now we're being kind of forced to make these decisions, and that, I think, is where there's a really emotional cut, because in the end, you know, it's most European immigrants within Britain aren't really economic migrants. Mostly they're people travelling because they've fallen in love with somebody, or they just like the country, or they want to do work of a certain type. It's not so to some degree it's a different case than the wider migratory issues. It's about identity, it's about who we feel we are, and about where we feel we belong, I think.
But people move where the money is. You know, I remember my granda, who was a bricklayer in the 1980s, working illegally in Germany for a Dutch gangmaster, and that's where he went because there was no work here. You know, so people will, and he worked in Sudan, he worked all over the world as a brickie, and that's what people do. You know, my man, he's an electrician, he travelled all around Britain being an electrician because he followed the money. That's what people, if people who are in their own home country think that they've got an opportunity for a safer, secure, or better life in another place, then that's what they'll do. That's just human behaviour. We just move to where we feel we're going to be most secure.
It is about conditions completely. However, if I was an economic migrant, I would definitely be living in Germany right now and not in the UK. And I think that's the case for quite a lot of...
But isn't there something, I mean, isn't this, you know, we're talking, rightly talking about how uncomfortable EU people feel here right now. But how uncomfortable must Scottish and British people be feeling, particularly young people, my kids' generation out, working in Germany, working in France, working in Italy, wherever it is, trying to... suddenly they now are also being... I mean, I suppose I'm trying to say that we will start to feel this come home when actually it's our relatives, our friends who are finding that they can no longer get the opportunities, when we can no longer do the things we just have become very used to doing, travelling and working wherever we want to work. I think that will also be a really painful moment.
It's very true. I'm not sure if both of you are aware, but I'm the creative director for an EU citizen organisation, EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland, and we have lots of partner organisations and make sure that we check up, especially with our counterparts in Europe. And yes, there are at least as uncomfortable a position as we are. They have the benefit of having to, the benefit and detriment of having to deal with, you know, different nations, and there is no concerted effort from the EU to make a streamlined process for all of them to go through. But we've already seen that, for example, the German government has tried to reassure them and has provided a process in which they can prove that they're fine where they are. But it has real life impacts as much as my life has been impacted. My counterpart in Frankfurt, I have a friend who lives in Frankfurt who had just saved up enough to deposit for a house at the time when Brexit hit, and they were not able to then put down that deposit just out of the insecurity of what's going to happen. There's been an awful lot of back and forth. And aside from all that, the actual people who have already swapped countries, though as Europeans we consider ourselves to be doing the European thing. Freedom of movement is, you know, it's not a migrant issue. The people that have not moved and have not taken advantage of European freedom of movement yet are people who are losing their rights just as much. You are losing your EU citizenship and potentially the opportunities that come with it, the loves and lives that are hinging on that.
And it's interesting how young people are fantastically adaptable and how they're prepared to, you know, find the way out of this. And if I look at, you know, my kids who, because of their grandpa's heritage, can get Irish passports if they choose to, as can, you know, their dad, my partner. So people are finding ways of circumventing it. But even though it's incredibly attractive, and loads of people are getting Irish passports just now just because of they're able to capitalise on their heritage. But actually, I don't know what the unintended consequences of that are going to be politically for Scotland. I mean, it's great being able to retain your EU citizenship. I would do it in a heartbeat if I was able to. But what does it mean if we've got this generation of young people who, in order to protect their EU citizenship, are actually possibly going to be given something up in relation to the country that they're living in, or their home country? So I don't know what the consequences of that adaptability in terms of national identity is going to be in the long term, but you know, we'll find it in 30 years. It
creates another division, doesn't it? I remember when I used to do workshops, schools workshops, drama workshops when I was living in Glasgow, when I first moved over to Glasgow, and I always used to do a workshop where I would, just to get people running about, I would sort of say the floor of the room was a map of Britain, or, you know, and I'd say go to where you were born, go to where your granny was born, just to get people running about. I had to sort of stop doing it in Glasgow because there was a bit at which half the room runs over to northwest of Ireland, and suddenly the room just had a slightly different mood, and it was just all a bit. So, and there's something about that with the Irish passport thing. It is brilliant and it's adaptable, but it's a little moment of just poking at a little wound and division that exists in the country, not bringing it together.
And it's an immediate solution, you know, to a particular person's personal issue. but it's what it actually means going forward, I don't know.
One of the things that we keep getting told as EU nationals is, why don't you just become British? For many EU nationals, that is not a possibility. Each EU nation handles this differently, and for quite a lot of them, it is not possible to hold citizenship of another country, a third nation country that isn't another EU country. So by the time this has a perishable date on it, by the time that the UK actually becomes a third nation country, it is not possible for me to become a British citizen without giving up my German and EU citizenship. Not willing to do that. I mean, I'm not willing to take British citizenship in the first place, but for some people this would be a real concern, and these might be people who have to still amass time in order to be applicable for British citizenship. It is a incredibly complex issue.
There's also something for me that I would draw a bit of attention to, that this is actually 1,000 years of history. It's not just the last sort of 2 years. That Scotland has always had to negotiate between it. It exists on the same island as a very big and powerful neighbour, and it has to have some sort of relationship with that big and powerful neighbour. And it also, one means by which it can balance out its relationship with that big and powerful neighbour is by making friends in Europe. That's always historically been what the kings and queens of Scotland had to do. And in a way, it's how Scotland worked within empire as well, was sort of just keeping close enough to the big and powerful neighbour, but also finding friends elsewhere. And I think what's happened is England is suddenly sort of going, oh, we don't need anybody else, we can be all alone. And Ireland, Scotland, Northern Ireland, even maybe Wales, better going, oh, actually, wait a minute, now we're trapped in a room with one big and powerful neighbour, and at the moment that big and powerful neighbour is behaving very, very wildly, and it feels, being trapped in that room feels like very uncomfortable.
Have you ever looked at how people identify across the UK, whether British or like English, Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh? There's an interesting distribution of people who would self-identify as British. So London is one of the big places that self-identifies as British, which couldn't be more intercultural if it tried, right? The central belt of Scotland also, and Northern Ireland also quite has a strong representation of people identifying as British. Most of the other places actually identify as their geographic location, which I think is a really interesting thing to observe. There's a struggle going on here, but people are quite proud to be from where they are from.
And that whole concept of Britishness, you know, it's like there's like a sliding scale, you know, of Britishness. People can, if we think back to like the London Olympics in 2012, that was like a really, people were subscribing to a really positive image of Britishness, and I remember watching it thinking, oh bless them, this is quite nice for people who identify as British to be able to see something good happening, and to see that the representation of Britishness is not being, you know, just like white and masculine. So that was really interesting. But for me, that is just so alien to me. I cannot subscribe to Britishness because it's just no part of I'm no more British than I'm German. You know, for me it's just a completely alien thing. So although I am technically British, I have a British passport, I'm a British citizen.
In order to resign your British citizenship, you'd actually have to pay.
It's for me, I'm Scottish and I'm European, but most of all, I'm Southside Glasgow. It's the most important.
Yeah, it is about community, I think, from that point of view. Yeah, and maybe community is something that we'll talk on a little bit later on in the programme.
It's the British, it's very interesting, the British that people are ascribing to in London, I suspect, is a slightly different concept of Britishness. That was the reason for the hotspots in Northern Ireland and West Central Scotland.
Yes.
But that brings me to a thing I've thought for a while about Englishness, which is that part of this is an eruption of Englishness. And one of the problems that Britishness created was that for a long time, all that we might regard as good or positive within English identity, multiculturalism, the incredible kind of cultures created in places like Birmingham or Manchester, or long historical ethnic cultures in the northeast of England, all of that, they were sort of called British. That because English was identified as basically white and masculine, as you said. And of course, they are English. Those are English things. Manchester's an English city, and there's no reason at all why Englishness couldn't be as welcoming a thing. But once you created that division, then you create a situation that Englishness, in a way, can only express itself in that bad way, or in a way that has those tinges. Whereas Scotland, for reasons I do not know, but for the last 30 or 40 years, there was a concerted effort to understand that Scottishness could also contain all these other forms of being, you know.
Absolutely. Scotland has also made the effort to try and be part of Britain. The term North Britain was actually a sort of marketing drive from within Scotland to be recognised as part of this great British Empire, of the United Kingdom. You know, we wanted to be seen, we wanted to not be left out, not just be an appendage to the core of the idea. By now, that's got very different connotations.
The tragedy for me, a really deep tragedy of all of this for me, personally, I think is an identity thing, and it's that when we were in 2014, there was the chance for us to be within the European Union, an independent next door to another independent European Union country, and I think the first thing we might have done was talked about how we could work together and talked about a kind of identity, a bit like whether it would be Scandinavia, or a sense that, you know, there's a lot of shared history, and it just feels that all of that's just been slashed away by this process. It's raw choices, you have to be one thing or the other, and it's just all of the complexity and fluidity that the European Union has allowed us with identity is now being ripped away.
I think that's a really interesting point. We're arguing, we would like politics arguing for things, but the politics that are taking place are actually making people divide into being against something. A lot of the argument that we hear about Scotland not becoming independent is technically about how, you know, I don't want my English family to become foreigners. As somebody raised on the continent, I can't tell you that I've ever perceived any of my relatives or friends as foreigners, and we will, no matter what the geographic lines will be that we draw or not draw, people will still be your neighbours. It's about finding solutions that work for the entire context. It is not about othering people, it is about finding your own identity and finding ways to get on with each other. I really, it's very hard for somebody who hasn't been raised in this context to even grasp the depth of that argument, because it seems utterly ridiculous that we would become foreigners.
And it is ridiculous, but it's a real indication of how people feel. So again, it's what we were talking about earlier, it's not about statistics, it's not about actual fact, it's about how people feel. And that's why, you know, when I think about, you know, the momentum that there was in 2014, and, you know, how we thought we were on the cusp of change and something different could happen. And I think about it now, you know, with that post-failure deflation, and I think, you know, actually nothing's changed. It's like when you were saying about Limmy earlier on, it's not, nothing's any different. You know, the arguments haven't moved on anymore. Although there are other things happening in relation to Brexit and Britain and, you know, where Britain fits in the world, in terms of those same arguments that were played out about, you know, are we Scottish, are we British, are we independent, are we not, actually it's not moved on. You know, and my personal feeling is it would be another failure than it, much to my, you know, distress, because until we can actually, you know, try and change people's, and this is impossible, and until people can change their identity about how they feel, about who they are at the core, then, you know, we're just going to be in this self-fulfilling cycle of, you know, where are we going, what are we doing?
It's a downward spiral.
You talked about self-harm, and I think that's a very interesting metaphor for where Britain is at the moment, and some of the ways we would think about why people self-harm. Is it a cry for attention? Is it expression of pain that can't come out in another way? But I also think Scotland, I sometimes think that the metaphor of Scotland is a wounded psyche, a wounded sort of polity that is like, sometimes damage is too much. Sometimes the damage that you have you can't quite ever get over it. And I do sometimes wonder if that maybe is where Scotland is at, that we'll never quite get over the depths. So that's a very negative, pessimistic
It actually
thing,
isn't. As a German, I can tell you that being humbled is something that can be incredibly productive and socially worthwhile. Mm-hmm. It refocuses you, and I'm actually quite interested in seeing what role you think the arts plays in reflecting that kind of conundrum. One of the highlights of my last year was Alan Bissett's play that he wrote. I seem to have forgotten the title, but I'm sure you'll remember it.
He's written a lot of plays, so
yeah,
I don't know necessarily which one. But
this was one about it was a representation of somebody personifying the United Kingdom, the British Empire, and then a Scottish person arguing against them, then interrupted by somebody coming in, and it was one of really the cultural highlights of my year, because I was able to withdraw and sit in the back and not be part of this Britishness, and this was what the play was challenging. But to see the reaction from the audience, to be confronted with different own stereotypes, I thought it was incredibly powerful, and I wasn't watching the stage, I was watching the people around me suddenly feeling incredibly uncomfortable in their own skins, no matter if they define themselves as British or Scottish.
I mean, you talked about stories. It's the stories people tell, it's who they feel they are. Theatre is my world, and I particularly think that theatre is very, very good at empathy. It's about looking at people, people's lives, and imagining, what if I was them? How would I respond to this situation? Are they doing the right thing? Would I feel like, you know, how would I feel if I was in such and such a position? I'm not sure that the job of culture particularly is journalistic. I think the job of culture, job of theatre, is to gather us all in a room. It's one of the last spaces where we all gather in one place. We're all together with our bodily odours and our noise and our humanness. We're not on the edge of a screen like that. We're together next to each other, and on the stage are humans, and we look at a story, and ideally the story might help us to reflect on where we are in the world. I don't like it when it's too head on, and then we talk about it afterwards. We talk about it with our friends and the people we've come with, and hopefully we're a bit expanded. I would go so far as to say, I think without theatre and without culture, you're not properly democratic, because you're not. It's culture that is the web that makes you interconnect with other people and understand what it might be like to be in their shoes. So democracy is very important, because that manages power and it manages the economy and these things. But without culture, I feel like the two things have to happen at the same moment. Otherwise, it's not a healthy state.
Absolutely. And how do you feel that Brexit is impacting your field?
Well, at the moment, there's a number of impacts. I mean, there's very sort of boring impacts, that a lot of schemes that were about bringing shows moving across borders, working with theatres in Germany, whatever, those things are just a bit harder. I mean, in some ways, but the biggest impact actually is that people are so jangled, their nerves are so jangled at the moment, that the kind of programming that people want to come to the theatre to see is, I think we're finding people want warm things and inclusive and kind. I mean, it's almost like comfort, yeah, like a lovely soup or like a nice hot bath. And so there's weirdly, the impact on the arts at the minute is just on the sort of work that people are making, and they're finding that people want to come and see. Some of the harder-edged political stuff that maybe we used to do, actually people don't want that. It's like, I've got enough of that every day. Yeah. But no, more broadly, it's going to have a very negative effect. It's just that, to be truthful, right now we're still in the EU, and right now actually we're still essentially coasting the way that we always were, just trying to absorb what's going on, but yeah, I mean, it's plainly going to be a sad and impoverishing feature of the way we make work now.
I believe quite literally impoverishing, because there's a significant part of EU funding that comes from the EU through our contributions comes back as arts and cultural funding, and obviously that empowers Scotland.
But again, there's a whole class thing here, and that, because if to use that particular example, in in an environment where there are people who are perhaps not that interested in you know, remaining in the EU, whose access to theatre and culture and things like that is, you know, incredibly limited, perhaps because they have put up barriers themselves and not because...
But also maybe nobody's gone to see if they want to come and see anything.
And so to say, you know, the impact on arts and culture is going to be really dreadful, it'll be like, so what?
Yeah.
That's not part of my life, it's not part... And I'm not saying that that's the right thing to say, but for many people it's just not something that's relevant to them, or they don't feel it's relevant to them. It's just another thing that they would, you know, perhaps say is a waste of money when people don't have hussies, because they think that, you know, budgets can be moved about and something for one can get moved across there and produce something that they're more interested in, which we know doesn't happen. But I think you're right. I think the impact, the long-term impact on arts and theatre and culture in this country is going to be really damaging.
I also think it's about, I 100% agree with you, and I think that, you know, I'm not a big advocate of theatres, you know, being special cases when people, councils are having to shut care homes and things like that. I absolutely see that there is a class thing there, but there is also, it's about how you define culture, and film, television, but also music. Also, there's a lot of impacts that would be things that people might say, well, I'm not interested in ballet and I don't go to the theatre, but the fact that just the band that are playing in your pub, or your kid's chance to get a music lesson, or all of that is also bound in. And I think there will be detrimental effects across the board. I would agree, though, the biggest detrimental effects will be economic, will be, it's not that, these are secondary problems after the economic
I suspect that this is part of the impoverishing nature that Brexit is going to have on the creative industries, that it's actually not just about, you know, specific funding coming in, though that's going to be an issue, and I'm sure it already is, though these things start at the fringes and then work their way in. It's that people will be very busy trying to find food in their supermarkets. There's going to be real problems with getting people into housing.
It's about people, maybe that's the thing. Free movement is actually a really, really brilliant thing. In fact, it should be expanded outside of Europe as well. But anyway, free movement, it's the loss of free movement that will affect culture. It's not about schemes. That's a side thing. It's the fact that the boy or girl who grows up in Pollock and is interested in music, or just takes a train somewhere, or finds a way and has an experience somewhere, and then brings that back and makes something. That's what we will be cutting down on. Brecht, your countryman, my favourite playwright, said, "Grub first, then art," and I think that you know, there's a great truth in that.
That's realpolitik. It really is. I mean, you know, and I think it's a very art-related topic. A lot of artists are excellent at what they do, but cannot feed themselves with that, and sometimes that means that you're going to have to look at what's on your plate rather than what you put out on the stage. That's how it works sometimes. In terms of community, I think you're quite knowledgeable, and I'm particularly interested, before we end the programme for today, to look at community and see how we can look at strengthening resilience. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I'm really embedded in the south side of Glasgow. I live in Port Shields. I've worked in Govan Hill for, you know, a dozen years or more. So for me, community means so many different things. And I think, especially within that Port Shields community, where, you know, I've raised 2 kids with my man, we've got a business there, so we're doing everything that we're supposed to do. And I feel that we're, you know, fairly safe and fairly protected. It's like there's a cushion between us and the rest of the world, because actually most people are prepared to at least are prepared to either put time and effort into building resilience in the community, whether it's, you know, just like somebody organising a litter pick, or, you know, the folk that are taking photographs, are, you know, people parking so that people with prams get. The community means an awful lot of things, but in fact, on the south side of Glasgow, there's something that's been really interesting that's been happening for a number of generations, and it goes back to migrated communities. It's about, you know, the contribution and the mixing of migrated communities with Indigenous, white Scottish, historically migrated Irish communities, and how that actually has worked more or less okay. When I think about, you know, my own Pollock Shields community and the connections that exist between the different faith groups, non-faith groups, it's hard to see where the divisions are. You know, everybody's experience is different, but, you know, in Pollock Shields, we're just like, you know, borrowing sugar off of our neighbours and getting on, but it takes a lot of time and effort. You've got like anchor families, anchor people and communities that are, you know, working really, really hard to get things done. And then you've got other organisations for whom, you know, they seem to get things very, very easily. And that's, you know, the nature of nepotism and all of that kind of thing. But in terms of the sustainability of communities, you know, people need to ask their neighbours what they would like in their community and not make assumptions. Because I think that's where a lot of it goes wrong, is about people thinking that they know what the person next door actually wants as part of your community.
I think I really like all of what you're saying. I find that really interesting, and I think sometimes there's easy talk about community, particularly on the left, particularly I think often middle class leftists will say, oh yes, community is great. And I live in a smallish village, North Queensferry. I've been on the community council, done various things. It's a very privileged village actually in some ways, but one of the things that you immediately learn about community is it's actually really, really hard work. It's about working with, it's about dealing and engaging with people who you disagree with, who annoy you, who rub up against
really
you.
Annoy you.
Yeah. It's things like there's families, like you talked about anchor families. It's a really interesting idea that if you've got a good anchor family somewhere, that the incredible benefit that can spread around a community. But then if you've got a bad anchor family, in some ways that can also spread. You know, all of this is about it's labour, often labour done by women, usually labour done by women, but certainly invisible labour or less celebrated labour, just day by day by day, and that's what. And until we have a political system that understands that, I think, you know, well, the work's going to carry on. People are going to do it, but it, you know, we're not helping build the communities.
I think there's in that whole kind of Glasgow context, the powerful position in communities is the scheme maw. You know, I'm a scheme maw. I know so many scheme maws where the people who, you know, will give somebody else's way into trouble in the street if they see them doing anything wrong.
Oh no!
And tell your mum and dad to come up to my door if they've got a problem about it. But it's the same way that you'll see the next time and you'll go, oh, how have you been getting on at school? And you're building relationships with these young people. So there's definitely something about, you know, being a scheme maw, and people come to you and ask you, people have a problem and they know that you might know where the answer to that problem will be. So there's these kind of, there are anchor families and communities that, you know, if they wanted to run away with it, they could become, you know, it could become quite negative. But the anchor families and communities are really important because they're the link a lot of the times, or they give the confidence to other people to go out and find the answers to their problems, and they can establish networks of people who maybe wouldn't ordinarily have known each other. And when you establish those networks, then people can find solutions to things.
I would agree with that. I think there's an additional thing that we need to mention here. I think Brexit is going to leave people emotionally very unstable. I've experienced that myself. I know my environment has, and the longer we go on, the more I see non-migrant people realising the real severe impact. The one thing that I can advise anybody to do is to find something that you care about and find your interest group. If you can't find your local community, find your interest and find the people that will fight with you. They will come and become your family. They will be the important members of your immediate environment, and they can pull you through. All of us, none of us are an island, and there will always be people who share opinions with you. Try to find people that are interested in the same things as you, and then try to achieve together, because you will not be alone. You will have people on your side. You might not be a scheme mum, you might not be a community champion, but you can be part of something bigger than yourself, and it is the most healing and most powerful thing that people can do, to find their place as part of a group without losing their own identity. So, for a last wee thing, I think we should be talking about international understanding of the arts and also culture. And when we look at Scotland, one of the big things that we've got going on for Scotland is obviously the fringe. Last year we've already seen that there's been quite a lot of issues around migration and getting people to come into the country, people being denied visas.
Sorry.
No, go on.
Well, I mean, again, it's a sort of second order problem, because the problem exists for everybody. Getting visas is difficult if you come from certain parts of the world. But artist visas, i.e. if we have festivals, we have the book festival, we have the fringe, we have all kinds of, we have Celtic connections, all kinds of reasons why we want to invite artists to come and perform here and to show us their work or to collaborate with them. And it is increasingly difficult and humiliating, actually, sometimes for them to get visas. Artists from particularly Middle Eastern countries, from Egypt, from Palestine, it's where I've done a lot of collaborations. And the processes they have to go through, and the fact that in the end these visas are denied, is a building problem. And I would think of it as the canary in the coal mine, in a way, of the bigger problem, because, you know, okay, artists are important in some ways, but the bigger thing to recognise is if even artists, so I mean even people who are coming, they're being welcomed by organisations, it's part of a very, very visible public structure. If even they can't do ordinary travel, then what is happening to the person who just wants to come and visit their brother, or maybe come and do a small bit of work or whatever it is. So yeah, it's a serious issue.
I agree, and I think it's also one of the reasons why we can start to empathise. There's a difference between seeing a story on television and seeing somebody from a certain community tell you their story in person and be part of that. Maybe a second last wee thing that we should do was look at how Netanyahu has vowed to annex Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. It's that kind of situation that causes me the exact same facial reaction as you did.
When I saw that, when I read this article this morning and read about this, I thought, well, firstly, there's nothing new here, because this is his raison d'etre. He's been saying this for years. But then when you look at the context of an election, I was, once again brought back to, oh, great, another older man making a really bad decision based on his, empowering himself. It's just like Brexit. It's just, there's this whole generation of men that are just doing horrible, terrible things politically in order to secure their own position. And this is just another one. And, it's like there's no surprise at all that Netanyahu is wanting to annex the West Bank, because he's been saying it for years.
I mean, and also, there's a specific thing about what does it really mean, but that's not really important. The fact is, it's already annexed. I just think it's sort of the way we talk about Palestine sometimes in the media, as if there is any real authority there, and there isn't, and there hasn't been. So him saying this is, obviously, it's shocking, it's unpleasant, it probably presages more violence and oppression for the people living in the West Bank. There's nothing good about it, but there's also nothing necessarily profoundly different about it. It's what has always been.
I think the only consistency that we can see is that once one person backs up that sort of attitude on an international stage, it is possible for people to come out more and more overtly and say these impossible things.
He's only saying it because Trump is in the White House, that allows him to say it.
That was exactly what I was going for.
Yeah, well,
yes. So on an international stage, this is why I think that arts and culture area is really important. We are ambassadors of the places that we stay at, the communities that we care for, and the more international recognition, like Scotland has sought, friendships across in Europe. The same way we need to continue to hold our torches for the places and the things that we care about. So that's us for today at Broadcasting Scotland and on the Full Scottish. Thank you to my guests for being here, and I hope you had a good time with us today. Have a good Sunday. Bye.